And all of a sudden, Moses' life is completely different from anything he's ever known. All of the luxury of his life, all the plans for his life, they've gone up in smoke. And he becomes a shepherd. A far cry from being a prince in Egypt. He begins to work for this guy named Jethro, who later becomes his father-in-law when he marries his daughter, Zipporah. And listen to this next part. And for 40 years, everybody say 40 years, 40 years. I want to make sure you keep that in your mind. For 40 years, Moses is a shepherd in the desert. Talk about your life not going in the direction that you thought it was going to go in. But remember, a trip to the desert isn't necessarily a bad thing. Well, one day, Moses, when Moses was approximately 80 years old, he is out tending the sheep. And we find this story in Exodus chapter 3. And the Bible says that Moses came to this mountain named Horeb, which means the mountain of God. And there is this burning bush. And the bush doesn't burn up. It just keeps burning and burning and burning. And God speaks to Moses out of this burning bush. And this is what God says to Moses, verse 9. The Israelite cry for help has come to me, and I've seen for myself how cruelly they've been treated by the Egyptians. It's time. Moses is probably thinking, it's way past time. It's time for you, Moses, to go back. Moses, these 40 years that you've spent in the desert have prepared you for action. Testing brings endurance, and endurance gets us ready for action. Moses, you've been thinking that everything worth having has passed you by, but now you are going to discover your reason to live. Right? My friend, if you are in a difficult situation, if you're in a transitional situation, I want you to know this morning it might just be the catalyst for the greatest days that you have ever known. So here's Moses, and he's talking to God, and God says, Moses, I know you probably thought that I had forgotten all about you and forgotten about the children of Israel, but I haven't. Moses, I was just preparing you through the desert, through this time of testing to become a man of action. Those first 40 years as a prince in Egypt kind of spoiled you. So Moses, you needed some time, you needed some hardship to toughen you up so that you could bridge the knowing and doing gap. And now you're ready. Because I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the people of Israel, out of Egypt. I love this story because it speaks to us no matter our age. You know what it teaches us? It teaches us that the tough times in life are training ground for something bigger and better. If you are a 50-pluser, think about this. 80 years old. And Moses starts his ministry. It's never too late in life to start. It's never too late in life to become a person of action. And if you're younger, and most of you are, think about this. What if the present situation, what if the present difficult situation you find you're in is really just a strategic inflection point where God has placed in your life and He's choosing to maneuver you in to that place where He has wanted you to be all along? I love that thought, and you know what? That's how God works. I'm excited about what God is doing in my oldest daughter's life. Her name is Kylie. She's 19. Kylie is in nursing school, and she's at the top of her class, 98.9. Woo! Way to go, Kai. But here's the thing. Kylie started working. We believe in working hard in our family. She started working when she was 14, and she worked for McDonald's. We thought, well, this is just going to be kind of a tentative thing. But she was such a good employee that she just went right up the line, the chain of command, and she became a shift manager, and she was thinking about switching things. But guess what? Mom and Dad were praying all along, and about 2 months ago, Kylie kind of hit a brick wall. she hit a strategic inflection point, and today she's in nursing, what mom and dad wanted her to do all along. Woohoo! No, what we believe that God has called her to do. And teens, you need to know that no matter what's going on in your life, if God has called you to do something, He's going to maneuver the situation of your life, maybe even bring difficulty to push you and bring you and cause you to choose what He wants you to do along with the rest of us. That's an awesome thing. Here's what James has to say about this scenario. Consider it a sheer gift, friends, when tests and challenges come at you from all sides. Yea, God. You know that under pressure, your faith life is forced into the open and it shows its true colors. So, with that thought in mind, knowing that difficulty is for our good, James says, don't try to get out. Don't try to weasel your way out of anything prematurely. Remember again, Moses was in the desert for how many years? 40 years. And here's why. Because we need to let the tough times do their work in us so that we become mature and well-developed, not deficient in any way. In other words, let the tough times shape you so that you will be prepared for the activity God has planned for you. You see, church, it is really true. A trip to the desert isn't necessarily bad because it can prepare us for action. And action, by the way, is very important in the life of the believer. That's why we've been talking about it for the past 5 weeks. You see, the truth of the matter is that real faith eventually results in action. If there's not action sooner or later, according to James, there's not real faith. That's why we've been talking about this. How we, in greater measure, as a church, as the people of God, can become people of action. So here's what happened next with Moses. When God says to him, I want you to go back to Egypt and deliver the children of Israel, Exodus 4, verse 1, Moses objected. He said, they won't trust me. They won't listen to a word I say. They're going to say, God appeared to you, Moses? Hardly. Now check out this next part because this is so applicable. So, God says, what's that in your hand? What's that in your hand, Moses? And church, here's where we begin to understand very clearly why God brought Moses to the desert. Put yourself in this scenario. Think about it. If God would have allowed Moses to stay in Egypt, and then while Moses was in Egypt, asked him, Moses, what is in your hand? What would Moses have said? He would have said, well, all the privileges of being royalty. I have a lot at my disposal that I can offer you, God. A lot that I can do for you, being Prince of Egypt. But God knew that this would get Moses nowhere. So God sent Moses to the desert where he would become a shepherd. And watch this. And what he held in his hand in the desert, a staff, although an important tool for a shepherd, would be far less significant, worldly speaking, than what he would have held in his hands as the Prince of Egypt. Do you see this? This is an important life lesson. Because most of the time we ask ourselves, why, oh why, has God sent me to the desert? Why is God making me walk through this desert? Well, one of the reasons that God sends us to the desert is so that you and I can take inventory, honest inventory, of what we hold in our hands and what is really important to us. And sometimes God takes us to the desert for the very purpose of stripping away some of the things that we hold so tightly to. Verse 2. So God says, what's that in your hand? And Moses answers, a staff. And then look at what God asked Moses to do with what little he had. He said, throw it on the ground. Take what you have, Moses, and let it go. I know that you're a shepherd, and I know that your staff is important to you, but I want to show you what's more important than what you hold in your hand. So let it go, throw it down. And so Moses threw it down. And at that moment, something miraculous happened. Are you getting this? A trip to the desert isn't necessarily bad, because it can prepare us for action. Our part, and this is what God needed from Moses, I believe the 40 years in the desert were to bring Moses to this point where he threw this down. Our part is to offer God what is in our hands. My friend, again, if you are in the desert today, the best thing you can do is to authentically offer what is in your hands to God. It could be the very reason that He has brought you to the desert, and it could be the very thing that causes you to discover your purpose for living and what God has for you next. Now, church, I really want you to hear me. I think almost every single one of us here this morning want to be used by God. Here's the essential question that we have to respond to correctly if we are going to be used by God. Here is the essential question in bridging the knowing and doing gap. Are you ready? Our response to the question, what's in your hand, has everything to do with becoming a people of action. And there are two parts to this response. We live in an age of information. In some ways, the church is more organized and structured and more together than we've ever been. We know the answer to the question, what's in your hand? If I went around the room and I said, what's in your hand? What skill do you have? What talent do you have? Most of us could answer that question. And you know what? It's an important question to be able to answer. But the second part of this response, hear me, is far more important than answering the question, what's that in your hand? God says to Moses, what's that in your hand? And Moses answers a staff. And God says to Moses, throw it to the ground. Let it go. Give it up. You see, this is the tough part. What if Moses would have said, but God, this is my staff. This is what I used to make a living. I know how to use this staff, and without it, God, I really don't have any contribution to make to this whole thing. What would have happened if Moses would have said that? He'd still be wandering around in the desert, right? Here's why this second response is so tough for us. I think that there are more capable, talented Christians in the world today than ever before. But I also believe that we lack one thing. Think about it. When God asks us what's in our hands, boy, we sure can tell Him. You know, here are my core values, and on and on and on. But when He asks us to give it up, to lay it down, to let it go, what do? We tend to resist Him. By our actions, we tend to say no. And here's what's crazy about this. I really think that we want to be used by God. But many times we aren't being used by God because we want to be the ones calling the shots. You know, here's my talent, Lord, use it. Here's my gift. Here's my skill, God. Here's what I'm going to do for you, so come and bless what I'm going to do. In other words, we want to be used by God on our terms, not His terms. We want to do what we want to do for God, but we really haven't given Him what is in our hands. We just want Him to bless what's in our hands. But watch this. But what is in our hands can never be blessed until it is given. Big deal. This is where I'm at.